The council deliberated for 3 days while the galaxy held its breath. And during those 3 days, the Vethrani Dominion made one final desperate attempt to save itself. High Minister Kethvorin contacted every ally the Dominion had cultivated over 3,000 years of power, calling in favors and making promises and threatening consequences for any species that voted against Vethrani interests, but the calls went unanswered. The promises rang hollow, and the threats that had once terrified entire civilizations now seemed empty and weak. Species who had bowed to Vethrani demands for centuries suddenly found their courage, remembering every slight and every abuse and every moment when they had been forced to accept cruelty because they had no other choice. They looked at humanity's patient methodology and saw a path they might follow themselves, a way to stand against tyranny without firing a single shot. The council chamber filled once more on the morning of the verdict. And Ambassador Dae-Young Kwan took his seat with Commander Su-min Hyo and junior diplomat Tae-hee Lim beside him. The Vethrani delegation entered last, their gray faces showing the strain of 3 sleepless days. And Kethvorin walked to his senior seat with steps that no longer carried any pride. The speaker rose and the chamber fell silent. The council has reviewed the evidence presented by the human delegation, the speaker announced, and has reached a verdict by a margin of 107 to 3. Kethvorin closed his eyes, knowing what was coming. The Vethrani Dominion is found guilty of premeditated mass murder against the human species and of deliberately deceiving this council to avoid consequences for their actions. The words hung in the air like a blade falling, and for a moment no one moved or spoke. Then the speaker continued with a sentence that would reshape galactic civilization. The Vethrani Dominion is stripped of their senior council seat, effective immediately, and will hold only junior membership status for a period of no less than 500 years. A gasp moved through the chamber as species who had lived under Vethrani dominance realized what this meant. The Vethrani military will be reduced by 60% under council supervision, with all biological weapons research permanently banned and subject to ongoing inspection. Kethvorin gripped his chair as his life's work crumbled around him. Finally, the Vethrani Dominion will pay reparations to humanity, not in currency, but in service. The speaker paused to let the weight of the sentence settle for the next 100 years. Vethrani doctors, engineers, scientists, and teachers will be assigned to humanitarian missions across the galaxy, working alongside the species they once considered inferior, helping those in need without compensation or recognition. The chamber erupted in voices, some crying out in shock and others in celebration. And for long minutes, the speaker could not restore order through it all. The human delegation sat in silence, showing no triumph or satisfaction. Only the quiet dignity of people who had waited 18 months for justice and finally received it when order was restored. The speaker asked if any delegation wished to make a closing statement. And Ambassador Kwan rose slowly from his seat. He walked to the speaking platform and looked out at the assembled representatives, his face calm, but his eyes holding something that made even the oldest council members lean forward to listen. "I will not speak of vengeance or satisfaction," Kwan began, "because this day is not about what the Vethrani have lost, but about what humanity lost 18 months ago." He gestured, and the display systems came alive once more, showing the names of 3,000 dead scrolling slowly across every screen in the chamber. "These are the people who died on Accord Prime," Kwan said. "Diplomats and scientists and doctors and teachers and children who believed that the galaxy could be made better through kindness and cooperation." The names kept scrolling, and the chamber grew quiet as species after species watched the list go on and on. For 20 minutes without repeating, Ambassador Una Park dedicated her life to building bridges between worlds. Kwan continued, And her daughter Minji had just begun her own career in diplomacy when she was murdered alongside her mother. His voice remained steady, but something in his eyes spoke of grief that would never fully heal. They deserved justice, and today they have received it. But justice alone is not enough to honor their memory. He paused, and the scrolling names faded, replaced by a single image that made the chamber gasp. It was a symbol, a torch held by human and alien hands together. With words beneath it in 100 languages, Earth is establishing the Park Foundation, Quan announced. Named for Ambassador Una Park and dedicated to providing medical aid, agricultural support, and educational resources to any species in need. Free of political conditions, the chamber stirred with confusion as representatives tried to understand what they were hearing. The Foundation's first act, Quan continued, will be sending aid to the Vethrani colony on Keth 7, which is currently suffering from crop failure that their government has neglected during this crisis. Absolute silence fell across the chamber as the meaning of his words became clear. Humanity was offering help to the species that had murdered 3,000 of their people. Help that asked nothing in return and carried no conditions. The Vethrani delegation stared at Quan with expressions of complete incomprehension. Unable to process what they were witnessing, some will ask why we would help those who harmed us, Quan said. And the answer is simple. He looked directly at Kethvoran as he spoke. Revenge was never our goal. Justice was, and justice means building something better, not simply tearing down those who wronged us. He stepped back from the platform and bowed to the chamber. The humans of Earth will never forget those who died on Accord Prime, but we will honor their memory by continuing the work they believed in. The session ended and representatives filed out in a daze, many stopping to shake hands with the human delegation or offer words of respect and admiration. The Vethrani sat alone in their seats, ignored by everyone, watching as species they had, dominated for millennia, lined up to express solidarity with humanity. A young Qurayshi diplomat approached Commander Hio near the exit and asked the question that was on everyone's mind. How could you show mercy after such betrayal? She asked, her feathers rippling with confusion. When you had the power to destroy them completely. Hio considered the question carefully before answering. Because destruction would have made us like them, she said. And we want to be something better. The Qurayshi nodded slowly, understanding dawning in her eyes. And she walked away to share what she had learned with her delegation. Ambassador Quan stood at a window overlooking the stars, a small photograph in his hand showing the Accord Prime delegation on the morning of the massacre. Una Park smiled up at him from the image, her daughter beside her, both of them full of hope for a future they would never see. Rest now, Quan whispered. Your deaths meant something, and the galaxy will remember. The Vethrani would spend generations working to earn back what they had lost, serving the species they once oppressed, learning humility through labor and service, and everywhere they went, they would see humans working beside them, helping the weak and healing the sick and feeding the hungry. Never mentioning the massacre, but never forgetting it either. Earth's revenge had not been fire or fury or destruction. It had been patience and principle and the building of a coalition based on trust rather than fear. The galaxy would never forget the day when humanity taught them all that true strength lies not in the power to destroy but in the courage to build something better. And the Galactic Council had been left speechless, not by human weapons or wealth or military might, but by a kindness so profound that it changed everything it touched. This was humanity's gift to the stars, paid for in blood and grief and 18 months of patient planning. And it would echo through the centuries as proof that even the darkest betrayal could be answered with light. The Park Foundation began its work the very next day. And across the galaxy, species who had watched humanity's revenge unfold began to believe that perhaps kindness could be stronger than cruelty after all. 1 year had passed since the massacre on Accord Prime, and the Vethrani Dominion was bleeding from wounds they could not see. High Minister Kethvorn stood at the window of his office on the Vethrani homeworld, staring out at the gray sky that matched his gray skin. And he tried to understand how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. The economy was failing in ways that made no sense. Trade routes that had served the Dominion for centuries now bypassed Vethrani space entirely, and merchants reported that goods, which once flowed freely through their ports now, traveled longer paths to avoid them. Technologies they had licensed from across the galaxy stopped working properly as support contracts expired and were not renewed. And Vethrani engineers found themselves unable to maintain systems they had relied upon for generations. It is as if the galaxy has decided to forget we exist, muttered Kethvorn to his chief advisor, who stood trembling nearby with another report full of bad news. The advisor cleared his throat and explained that 7 more species had quietly withdrawn from trade agreements in the past month, always with polite excuses about changing circumstances or new opportunities elsewhere. But the worst news was something else entirely, something that had begun appearing on independent news networks across the galaxy. Anonymous data packages had started arriving at media outlets, containing fragments of information about the Accord Prime massacre. And the fragments were damaging enough to raise questions that the Vethrani could not answer. Security footage from station cameras showed Vethrani technicians in areas they should not have accessed, and communication logs revealed conversations that seemed to reference a plan weeks before the tragedy occurred. Bioweapon signatures recovered from the bodies matched Vethrani military research programs that were supposed to be secret, and financial records showed payments to contractors who specialized in genetic targeting. Nothing was conclusive by itself, but together, the pieces formed a picture that was becoming harder to deny. The council speaker had already received formal inquiries from 37 species asking for a new investigation, and even some of the Vethrani's oldest allies were beginning to distance themselves. Commander Sumin Hio reviewed the latest intelligence summaries in her office on Earth, tracking the spread of information with careful attention to timing and placement. And she nodded with satisfaction as she saw how effectively the truth was poisoning Vethrani influence. The data packages had been crafted with precision, each one containing just enough truth to be verified independently, but not enough to reveal how Earth had obtained it. And the sources were scattered so widely that no one could trace them back to humanity. The Koreshi had contributed communication intercepts from their intelligence services. The Omari had provided shipping records that showed suspicious cargo movements before the massacre. And a dozen other species had added pieces of the puzzle they had been quietly collecting. Junior diplomat Tae-hee Lim had coordinated the effort with remarkable skill, building trust among coalition members while ensuring that no single species bore too much risk. And her gentle manner had proven perfect for convincing nervous allies that the plan would work. Lim now sat across from a Vethrani scientist named Kethrovan in a secure room on a neutral station, listening as he explained why he had chosen to betray his own people. "I helped design the bioweapon," Kethrovan said, his gray hands shaking as he spoke. "And I told myself it was only research, only theoretical. Only preparation for threats that might never come." He paused, and his dark eyes filled with something that might have been tears. "Then I watched 3,000 people die because of what I created. And I saw our leaders celebrate their deaths as a victory. And I knew that I could not live with what I had done." Lim thanked him for his courage and promised that his testimony would help bring justice for those who had been murdered. And she meant every word because she had never stopped grieving for her brother, who had died on Accord Prime. The defector's information was devastating. A complete technical breakdown of how the bioweapon had been engineered using human genetic data obtained through the Council's medical sharing programs, it proved. beyond any doubt that the attack had been planned and deliberate. Not an accident as the Vethrani had claimed. And it exposed the lie that had protected the murderers for an entire year back on the Vethrani homeworld. High Minister Kethvoran received reports that made his blood run cold. 17 species had now formally requested a new council investigation, including 3 who had been Vethrani allies for over 1,000 years. And the speaker had announced that the matter would be discussed at the next full council session. Worse still, the Vethrani military reported that their patrol fleets were having trouble finding supplies, as port after port discovered scheduling conflicts or maintenance issues that prevented Vethrani vessels from docking. This is not coincidence, Kethvoran growled at his advisors, finally allowing himself to see what had been happening all along. This is coordination. This is planning. This is revenge. But even as he spoke the word, he could not understand how the primitive humans had managed at Earth had no great fleet to threaten Vethrani space, no economic power to rival the Dominion's ancient wealth, no political influence to match 3,000 years of council membership. What Earth had was something the Vethrani had never thought to fear. Earth had friends, real friends who had been treated with kindness and respect and who wanted to return the favor. And those friends were willing to take risks because they believed humanity deserved justice. Ambassador Quan stood before the council and responded to questions about the leaked information with perfect calm, expressing concern about the allegations while avoiding any direct accusations. Earth seeks only truth, he said, his voice carrying no anger despite the fury that burned inside him. And we trust the council to investigate these matters thoroughly. The Vethrani delegation watched him with growing unease, finally understanding that the silent human ambassador had been playing a game they had not even recognized. They had expected threats and demands and military posturing, the kinds of responses they understood and knew how to counter. And instead they had received patience and planning, and the slow tightening of a trap they could not escape. The session ended with the Tabray end speaker announcing a formal investigation into the Accord Prime incident. The first time in Vethrani memory that their word had been officially questioned by the council. Kethvoran returned to his quarters and stared at the wall for hours, trying to find a way out of the disaster that was unfolding around him. He had built his career on fear and intimidation, on the certainty that other species would never dare challenge Vethrani power. And he had never imagined that kindness could be a weapon more dangerous than any fleet. The humans had spent 50 years helping anyone who needed it, asking nothing in return except friendship. And now those friendships were destroying everything the Vethrani had built. Kethvoran finally understood what he was facing. But understanding came too late. The trap had already closed, and Earth's revenge was only beginning. 18 months had passed since the massacre on Accord Prime, and Ambassador Daeyun Quan stood before the Galactic Council with the weight of 3,000 souls resting on his shoulders. The chamber was more crowded than anyone could remember, every species sending representatives to witness what promised to be the most important session in centuries. And the air itself seemed heavy with anticipation and fear. The Vethrani delegation sat in their traditional place of honor, the senior seats they had occupied for 3,000 years. But their gray faces showed none of the confidence they had displayed in months past. High Minister Kethvoran gripped the arms of his chair with hands that trembled slightly, watching the human ambassador with eyes that had finally learned to see the danger they had dismissed for so long. The council speaker called the session to order and announced that Earth had requested emergency time to present evidence regarding the Accord Prime incident. And a murmur swept through the chamber as species who had waited 18 months for this moment leaned forward to listen. Quan rose from his seat slowly, moving to the speaking platform with measured steps that carried no urgency. And he stood in silence for a long moment, looking out at the assembled representatives of 100 worlds. I come before this council not to make accusations, he began, his voice calm and steady, but to present facts that have been gathered and verified by independent investigators from 17 different species. He gestured, and the chamber's display systems came alive with data. Documents, recordings, and analysis that told a story of calculated murder hidden behind lies. The first evidence was communication intercepts, provided by the Qurayshi intelligence services. Conversations between Vethrani officials discussing something called Project Cleansing in the months before Accord Prime. The Vethrani delegation shifted uncomfortably as their own words appeared on screens throughout the chamber. Words that spoke of eliminating a threat before it could grow too powerful. Next came financial records from Almari trading networks, showing payments to biological research facilities that specialized in genetic targeting. Payments that had been hidden through dozens of shell companies, but could now be traced directly to Vethrani military budgets. Security footage followed, recovered from Accord Prime Station's backup systems by Gentari technical experts, showing Vethrani technicians accessing ventilation controls in the hours before the ceremony. The footage showed the same technicians leaving the station on a Vethrani diplomatic shuttle just 30 minutes before the first humans began dying. Quan presented each piece of evidence without emotion, letting the facts speak for themselves. And the chamber grew quieter with each revelation as the scope of Vethrani treachery became impossible to deny. Then came the testimony that shattered any remaining doubt. A holographic projection appeared beside Quan, showing the face of a Vethrani scientist named Kethroven, whose dark eyes held the weight of unbearable guilt. I helped design the bioweapon that killed 3,000 humans on Accord Prime, Kethroven said, his voice steady despite the confession that would make him an enemy of his own people forever. He explained the technical details of how the weapon had been created, using human genetic data obtained through the Council's own medical sharing programs. And he described how it had been engineered to kill only humans while leaving other species unharmed. The attack was planned for over 2 years, Kethroven continued. And I was told it was necessary to prevent humanity from becoming too influential in council affairs. He paused and something broke in his expression. I watched 3,000 innocent people die because of what I helped create. And I cannot carry that burden in silence any longer. The projection ended and Quan turned to face the Vethrani delegation directly, his eyes meeting Kethvoron's for the first time since the session began. This evidence has been independently verified by investigators from 17 species, Quan said, including 3 who were formerly allied with the Vethrani Dominion. He raised his hand, and a list appeared showing the species who had contributed to the investigation. Names that represented a coalition built on trust and kindness rather than fear. We do not ask this council to take our word alone, Quan continued. We ask only that you consider the evidence and judge it fairly. He paused and his voice softened slightly. 3,000 humans died on Accord Prime, including Ambassador Unipark and her daughter Minji. And they deserve justice. The chamber sat in stunned silence as the display showed photographs of the dead. Faces from 100 different backgrounds united only by their humanity and their belief that the galaxy could be a place of cooperation rather than cruelty. Quan concluded his presentation with a simple question that carried the weight of everything humanity had suffered. The laws of this council are clear regarding member species who commit mass murder against other members and then deceive the council about their actions, he said. And I ask only that those laws be applied fairly. He returned to his seat, and the silence stretched on for long moments as representatives processed what they had witnessed. Then Kethvorn rose from his chair, his gray face twisted with desperation, and he began speaking in a voice that cracked with fear. These accusations are outrageous fabrications, he declared. planted by species who envy Vethrani greatness and seek to bring down the Dominion through lies and manipulation. He pointed at the human delegation with a shaking hand. The humans have conspired with our enemies to create false evidence, using their 50 years of so-called kindness to build a network of traitors who would destroy the natural order of the galaxy. But as he spoke, something remarkable happened. No one listened. Species who had nodded along with Vethrani's statements for 3,000 years now turned away, whispering among themselves or studying the evidence displays. And Kethvorin's words fell into empty air. The Karishi delegation rose as one and demanded recognition from the speaker, their feathers bright with righteous anger. "We provided the communication intercepts," said their ambassador, "and we verified them with our own intelligence services because we remember what humans did for us when our people were dying." The Omari delegation stood next. "We provided the financial records," said their representative, "because the humans treated us fairly when no one else would, and we owed them the truth." One by one, species rose to confirm their contributions to the investigation, to declare their belief in the evidence, to stand with humanity against Vethrani denial. Kethvorin kept speaking, but his words grew weaker as he realized that the power his people had held for millennia was crumbling. Around him, the session ended with the speaker announcing that the council would deliberate on the evidence and return with a verdict. And the Vethrani delegation left the chamber surrounded by silence that was louder than any condemnation. Ambassador Quan remained in his seat as the chamber emptied, looking at the photographs of the dead that still glowed on the display screens. Commander Hio approached him quietly and asked how he was. Feeling Quan considered the question for a long moment before answering. "I feel like we have finally given them a voice," he said. "And now we wait to see if the galaxy will listen." The waiting would not be long, and the verdict would change everything. 6 months had passed since the massacre on Accord Prime, and the galaxy watched Earth with a mixture of confusion and contempt as humanity did absolutely nothing that anyone could see. The Vethrani High Minister Kethvorin gave speeches about human weakness, mocking the primitive species that had not even managed to file a formal protest after losing 3,000 of their people. And other council members nodded along because agreeing with the Vethrani was always the safest choice. "They are children playing at civilization," Kethvorin declared at a council reception, his gray face twisted with amusement. "And children must be taught their place in the order of things." But beneath the surface of galactic politics, something strange was happening that few observers understood at first. Human doctors on the Thornaki homeworld requested transfers back to Earth, apologizing sincerely for any inconvenience and promising to train local replacements before they left. And the Thornaki Medical Council approved the requests without much thought. Human engineers working on the great shipyards of the Mevrani system resigned their positions one by one, citing family emergencies and personal matters that required their attention. And the Mevrani found themselves suddenly short of the expertise they needed to complete their newest vessels. Human agricultural experts departed from famine relief missions on 7 different worlds, always with perfect politeness and genuine regret, always leaving detailed instructions for continuing their work, and always vanishing before anyone thought to ask why so many were leaving at once. Commander Sumin Hio sat in her office at Earth Intelligence Headquarters, surrounded by screens showing data from across the galaxy, and she allowed herself a small smile as another report came in. The Karishi ambassador had just delivered a package of intercepted Vethrani communications, encrypted files that her people had been collecting for months, and the contents confirmed what Earth had suspected all along. The bioweapon had been designed specifically to kill humans, engineered using genetic data the Vethrani had obtained through the Council's medical sharing programs, and the attack had been planned for over 2 years before it was carried out. Hio forwarded the data to her analysis team and then opened a secure channel to Ambassador Quan. The Karishi came through, she reported, keeping her voice level despite the fury that burned in her chest. And the Olmari have agreed to redirect their shipping routes starting next month. Quan nodded slowly, his face showing nothing of what he felt inside. And he asked about the other species they had been cultivating. The list was longer than anyone would have expected. A quiet coalition of peoples who remembered what humans had done for them and who doubted the official story of Accord Prime. The Kirishi had lost millions to a plague before human doctors arrived with treatments that asked nothing in return. And they had not forgotten the kindness of Ambassador Park, who had held dying children in her arms and wept with their parents. The Olmari had prospered through trade agreements with Earth that treated them as equals rather than resources to be exploited. And they remembered how human negotiators had actually walked away from deals that would have harmed Olmari workers. The Gentry had been facing extinction before human scientists helped them solve their fertility crisis. And their council representative now voted against Vethrani proposals whenever she could do so without drawing attention. 12 species in total had quietly pledged to help Earth find justice. Not because they hated the Vethrani, but because they loved what humanity had shown them was possible. Ambassador Quan appeared at council meetings exactly as often as protocol required, speaking only when spoken to and always with perfect diplomatic courtesy. And the Vethrani grew bolder with each passing week. They began demanding tribute from smaller species who had previously been protected by unspoken agreements with Earth. And they sent their warships on patrol routes that brought them close to human colonial space. Quan responded to each provocation with nothing more than formal notes of concern. And the galaxy concluded that humanity had been broken by the massacre. But in the shadows, the web grew tighter. Human corporations withdrew from joint ventures with Vethrani partners, always with reasonable explanations about shifting market conditions or strategic restructuring. And the Vethrani economy began showing small cracks that their analysts could not explain. Supply contracts that had been stable for decades suddenly fell through as suppliers found other buyers or changed their terms. And Vethrani merchants discovered that ports which had once welcomed them now had scheduling problems that made trade difficult. Technologies licensed from human companies stopped receiving updates and support, always with apologetic messages about resource constraints and changing priorities. And Vethrani systems began failing in small but annoying ways. The High Minister summoned his economic advisors to explain why 17 major contracts had collapsed in a single month. And they stood before him with confused faces and empty hands. "It must be coincidence," said the chief advisor, though his voice carried no conviction. "Or perhaps some short-term market fluctuation that will correct itself." Kefvorn dismissed them with a wave of his gray hand. But a small seed of worry had planted itself in his mind. He called for intelligence reports on human activities and received summaries that showed nothing unusual. Just a species quietly going about its business while recovering from tragedy. And he told himself that the primitive creatures from Earth could not possibly be coordinating something this complex on a small moon in neutral space. Commander Hio met with representatives from 9 species in a room that officially did not exist. And they shared information and made plans and strengthened bonds that would matter greatly in the months to come. Junior diplomat Tae-hee Lim spoke for Earth at these meetings, a young woman whose gentle manner hid a fierce intelligence. And she listened more than she talked, because the coalition needed to trust each other before they could act together. "We do not trust the Vethrani," said the Karishi representative, her feathers rippling with emotion. "And we remember what your people did for ours when no one else would help. We want to help you," said the Olmari delegate, his amphibian eyes wet with feeling. "Because helping you is the right thing to do, and because the galaxy deserves better than Lethrani cruelty. Lim thanked them with genuine warmth and promised that Earth would never forget their courage. And she meant every word because she had lost her brother on Accord Prime and understood that justice required patience. The Vethrani sent a war fleet to patrol near human colonial space, a show of force meant to intimidate Earth into permanent submission. And the galaxy held its breath waiting for humanity's response. Ambassador Quan invited the Galactic Council to tour Earth's defensive installations, a strange response that puzzled many observers until they saw what humanity had been building. Massive underground cities stretched beneath every major population center, designed to shelter billions from orbital bombardment. And distributed manufacturing facilities meant that no single attack could cripple human production. Redundant food production systems guaranteed that Earth could feed itself for centuries without outside help. And medical facilities were hardened against every weapon the Vethrani were known to possess. The message was clear to anyone with eyes to see it. Humanity expected to be attacked, and humanity had prepared to survive whatever came. And humanity would still be standing long after their enemies had exhausted themselves trying to break them. The Vethrani fleet withdrew without firing a shot, and the High Minister screamed at his intelligence officers demanding to know how humans had learned of the deployment before it launched. No one had an answer because no one understood that the answer was trust. The trust of species who had been treated fairly by humans and who wanted to return the favor. The galaxy still thought Earth was weak, but the truth was something far more dangerous. Earth was patient, and Earth was planning. And Earth never forgot those who had been lost on Accord Prime. The reckoning was coming, and the Vethrani would not see it until it was far too late. The stars had never seemed so bright to Ambassador Una Park as they did on that morning aboard Accord Prime Station. And she stood at the observation window with a cup of tea warming her hands, while junior diplomats rushed around preparing for the ceremony that would change everything 50 years of. Peaceful cooperation had brought humanity to this moment, and Earth had earned its place among the stars, not through conquest, but through kindness and hard work and the simple belief that all species deserved help when they needed it. The Galactic Council had welcomed humans as junior members just 5 years ago, but already Earth's doctors had cured plagues on 12 worlds, and Earth's farmers had ended famines that threatened entire civilizations. Ambassador Park smiled as she watched a group of Koreshi children playing in the station's garden below, their feathers bright with joy as a human teacher showed them how to plant seeds from Earth. Ambassador, the Vethrani delegation has arrived early, said her aide J1 with a slight frown on his young face. Park nodded and set down her tea, smoothing her formal robes as she prepared to greet their hosts. And she pushed aside the small worry that had lived in her chest ever since the Vethrani had proposed this cultural exchange ceremony. The Vethrani Dominion was ancient and powerful, holding a senior seat on the council for over 3,000 years. And their tall gray forms and cold black eyes had watched humanity's rise with something that Park recognized all too well. She had seen that look before in the eyes of those who feared what they could not control. The ceremony hall was magnificent, filled with representatives from dozens of species who had come to celebrate the growing friendship between Earth and the wider galaxy. And Park moved through the crowd, shaking hands and touching tentacles and pressing foreheads in the greeting customs of 100 worlds. 3,000 humans filled the station that day. Scientists and doctors and teachers and their families who had given their lives to building bridges between species. Park found her daughter Minji near the refreshment tables, the young woman laughing with a group of Omari traders who were trying to understand the concept of ice cream. Mother, you worry too much, Minji said when she saw Park's expression, and she kissed her mother's cheek before returning to her new friends. The Vethrani High Minister Kethvoran stood at the center of the hall, his gray robes flowing as he raised his arms to call for silence. And the crowd turned to listen as he began speaking of unity and cooperation and the bright future that awaited all species who worked. Together, Park listened to his words but watched his eyes. And what she saw there made her blood run cold. There was no warmth in those dark depths, no genuine belief in what he spoke. And for just a moment, she saw something that looked like anticipation. She opened her mouth to speak, to call out a warning. But the gas was already flowing through the ventilation systems. The first humans began coughing within seconds, their bodies reacting to something that attacked their cells with terrible precision. And Park watched in horror as people she had known for decades collapsed around her. Minji fell first, her young body crumpling like a flower in a storm. And Park tried to run to her daughter, but her own legs would not obey her commands. The Vethrani delegation stood untouched, their gray faces expressionless as they watched 3,000 humans die in agony on what should have been a day of celebration. Park's last sight was High Minister Kethvoran stepping over her daughter's body without a downward glance. And her last thought was a prayer that Earth would find the strength to survive what was coming. The official report called it a reactor malfunction, a tragic accident caused by human negligence in maintaining their section of the station. And the Galactic Council accepted this explanation despite the desperate protests of Earth's remaining diplomats. "The evidence is clear," said the council speaker, a massive Thornaki whose stone-like face showed no emotion as he delivered the verdict that broke humanity's heart. "And the council extends its deepest sympathies to Earth for this unfortunate loss." Interim Ambassador Dae-Young Kwon stood in the chamber where his predecessor had stood so many times before, and he listened to the condolences that rang hollow in the vast space. He had known Yuna Park for 30 years, had served under her guidance as a young officer, and had wept when he learned that she and her daughter had died alongside 3,000 others who had trusted the galaxy to treat them fairly. The Vethrani delegation sat in their honored seats, and Kwon could see the barely hidden smiles on their gray faces as species after species offered meaningless words of comfort. He understood what had happened here, and he understood why the council refused to see the truth that was so obvious to anyone who cared to look. The Vethrani were powerful, ancient, and terrifying to those who had lived under their influence for millennia, and no one wanted to accuse them of mass murder without absolute proof that could not be denied. Kwon had no such proof, not yet, but he had something the Vethrani had not counted on. He had patience. The speaker called for any final statements, and every eye in the chamber turned to the human ambassador who had remained silent. Throughout the proceedings, Kwon rose slowly from his seat, his formal uniform crisp and his face carefully blank, and he walked to the speaking platform where he stood for a long moment, looking at each delegation in turn. "Earth accepts the council's verdict," he said, his voice calm and even, and a ripple of surprise moved through the chamber at his words. The Vethrani High Minister leaned forward, his dark eyes gleaming with triumph as he waited for the human to beg or threaten or break down in the grief that surely must be consuming him. Kwon did none of these things. He simply bowed, a deep and formal gesture of respect that somehow carried no respect at all. And then he turned and walked out of the chamber without another word. Several alien observers would later speak of the strange coldness in his eyes, a look that reminded them of deep space itself. Empty and dark and filled with patient waiting, the Vethrani celebrated that night, their victory complete and their message sent to any species that might think of challenging their dominance. And they laughed at the primitive humans who had not even possessed the courage to make threats. They did not notice the small Karishi diplomat who watched them from across the reception hall, her feathers flat with anger, and her mind already working on how to contact the humans who had saved her people. They did not see the Omari trainers speaking quietly in corners, their amphibian faces troubled, as they remembered every kindness Earth had shown them during their trade negotiations. And they certainly did not imagine that Ambassador Quan stood at his window that very moment, looking out at the stars with a small photograph in his hands, making a promise to 3,000 dead that their murderers would face justice. Earth would not forget, and Earth would not forgive. But Earth would wait. The galaxy was about to learn that humans measured revenge not in days or months, but in whatever time was needed to make it complete. The Vethrani had made their move, and now it was humanity's turn to play a game that would leave the Galactic Council speechless.